I'm Mark Applebaum, and this is the kickoff to a series on fundamentals of phenomenology, short presentations and conversations with colleagues that are intended for people who are new to this tradition in philosophy and psychology. A few words about me. My training and publications are in phenomenological psychology, which have applied particularly to consciousness studies, especially the study of religious and meditative experience. I've worked with people for 30 years in a hands-on way. I've always been more of a practitioner first and an academic secondly. First, I worked in San Francisco's community mental health system for years as a case manager, later expanding into counseling, coaching, and facilitating in for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And I also teach existential phenomenological research to doctoral students. And I'm co-founder of a nonprofit that makes use of phenomenology and hermeneutics in an interreligious approach to meditative experience. So, the examples that you're going to hear from me are based on my own experience in these multiple domains. This first episode is meant as a broad introduction to the spirit of phenomenological tradition, starting with Husserl. It's by no means intended to substitute for immersing yourself in the tradition, and along the way I invite you to notice the picture of the world that starts to form for you as you become acquainted with a phenomenological perspective, and especially notice what questions this raises for you, because phenomenology is a radically different way of encountering the world, a unique way of attending carefully to the experiences of others, a unique way of gaining new perspectives on your own self-experience, including what it means to be a self. So to begin with, a core premise of phenomenology is that when we talk about the world, what we mean is the world as it's given to consciousness. In other words, everything we can experience or know about the world is given to us by means of consciousness. And by given to us, I mean made present to us. Consciousness is the medium within which and through which we know the world, each other, and ourselves. So you might say that consciousness is the ocean within which we're swimming and through which we have contact with ourselves and with others. This picture of an already present underlying interconnection or interrelatedness of self and world and self and others in consciousness may already feel challenging. If you were educated to imagine yourself as somehow standing outside of the world, or strictly separable from the world around you, or strictly separable from other people. The basic premise of phenomenology, in contrast, is that we're always already in the world. Even if I'm sitting at home alone like I am right now, recording this, I'm extending myself in an open way toward others. Some of you I know, most of you I don't know. I'm in the middle of a day in which I've already been actively speaking to people, a day in which I'm anticipating meeting with other people later, both remotely through this device and in person. So my horizon, as a phenomenologist might say, both past, present, and future, is never just me in strict isolation, but me in relation to a host of other people and places. Now, you might say, wait a minute, this sounds really heady. Is all I have my subjective experience? Isn't real knowledge based on setting aside my own impressionistic, subjective experiences, which are biased and prone to error, and focusing on just the objective facts? But as you're going to see in upcoming episodes, phenomenology rejects this framing of subjectivity versus objectivity as overly simplistic and reductive. Instead, phenomenology observes that the world of science and scientific theories is built on and depends on the world that we already inhabit together. So, setting aside for a moment scientific theories and turning to the world around us, phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty claim that the pre-scientific world, what we call the life world, is prior to and the basis for any theoretical abstractions and scientific discoveries. Science emerges from careful reflection upon the life world, from within the world, not from a position that's somehow outside of the world. So what's the problem? Isn't this all obvious? Husserl pointed out more than a century ago that when scientific theories like gravity or measures like degrees centigrade become so normalized and so taken for granted that we see them as merely facts, there's a reversal in which these theoretical abstractions are taken to be more real and truthful than the life world itself. When that reversal happens, theories or theoretical terms that are useful for scientists start to become labels that obscure our contact with the immediacy of our own experience, because we get absorbed in just labeling things instead of first encountering them. An example that comes to mind was that sometimes, as a counselor, clients of mine would start to label themselves as their diagnosis. For example, as a schizophrenic, or as a bipolar person, or as a borderline, or just generally as a patient. And something that I always felt reductive and something to be moved past in relating to the person as a person. So notice, I am not questioning the usefulness of diagnoses in psychiatry. Not at all. Instead, I'm using this as an example of what happens when we go around labeling by attaching, as if attaching post-it notes to other people, to the world, to ourselves, to our own experiences, instead of first attending to who is present and how in the first place. The phenomenological argument is that reifying scientific theories leads to a forgetting of the life world, losing embodied contact with the world and ourselves. So taken to an extreme, this arguably produces a rupture with our source of moment-to-moment meaning, and ultimately produces a kind of sterile circularity. This is close to the heart of what Husserl termed the crisis of the sciences. So what is this life world? For phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, the world is always already given to us prior to reflection. As embodied beings, we're always already immersed in a world and already sensing and feeling fully engaged through attraction, aversion, pleasure, pain, attached to the world we find ourselves in and to the others in it. So an example of this already being meaningfully present to the world is the way my body reacts to touching a hot stove by pulling away. Before the thought occurs, I burned myself. See? Or I'm already in the midst of an inspired, joyful mood by the time I name it as such. Or similarly, I'm already weighed down by heaviness and a sense that everything and everyone around me is oppressive or burdensome before it occurs to me to name what I'm feeling as sadness or as depression or as something heavy. The naming that happens through reflection, at its best, shines more light on what's actually already occurring. Much of what we prize about conceptuality is that we awaken further to what's already being lived, which in and of itself can transform the experience of living it. Now, in contrast, if we assume that theoretical constructs are more truthful than the life world itself, then we end up trying to squeeze whatever our actual experience is into those pre-existing theoretical categories. The assumption would go something like this: unless I can label what's occurring to me using an existing theory, I can't understand myself, or I can't understand the world. I prove my knowledge, in other words, by attaching a theoretical label to something. So what's wrong with that? You might say maybe these theoretical categories are actually our best chance to really deeply understand what's going on in the first place. And I want to be careful here to emphasize that none of what I'm saying is against theory, but rather for phenomenology, the world itself and lived experience in the world always exceeds, is always richer than whatever any particular theoretical lens could reveal about it. And for that reason, as useful as theories can be, we always want to come back to a foundation in the way that experience is already given prior to theorizing about it, and prior to trying to explain an experience. And we'll talk about this in the future. Phenomenology claims that we can describe experience richly and in detail without resorting to theory. So, as a way of bringing this first episode to a close, I want to tell a story to dramatize what's at stake for phenomenology in our desire to refrain from prematurely imposing theoretical frameworks. And that story is the Greek myth of Procrustes. In the story of the hero Theseus, one of the trials he undergoes is facing and defeating Procrustes, who's a robber and a murderer hiding out in the mountains of Attica. And Procrustes was a particularly brutal and sadistic kind of criminal because he would waylay lonely travelers in the mountains and tie them to a bed made of iron. If the unlucky traveler was too tall and his legs hung out over the edge of the bed, Procrustes would saw them off to make the victim fit the bed and thereby kill him. On the other hand, if the traveler was too short for the bed, Procrustes would stretch the victim's body until he fit the bed exactly, and in that way he would kill him. So as a hero, Theseus has to defeat Procrustes, and as you can probably imagine, the way he does so involves the iron bed. The Procrustean bed is a metaphor, for our purposes, for the kind of misguided views that force people's living, embodied experience to fit a rigid, predetermined model, even if it kills what's most alive about the experience in the first place. So think, for example, of, say, a 10-question survey instrument that's meant to gauge your sense of well-being. Could 10 questions, skillfully designed, point towards something real about your sense of well-being, or your lack thereof? Well, sure. But will they tell you everything about the fullness of meaning of well-being for you? Of course not. So if we naively convince ourselves that this survey is the gold standard for what our well-being really means, then we have to cut off all the human meanings that don't fit into that iron bed and throw them away. Now, that's not good empirical scientific practice either, so I'm not criticizing the proper use of survey instruments right now. I'm pointing out how, as Husserl recognized, scientific achievements tend to get sedimented in society, and that facilitates a kind of naive, dumbed-down relationship in which scientific theories or measures are regarded as merely facts, not potentially useful but only partial interpretations of the world. So, in this first episode, really the only term that I've addressed is Lifeworld. And of course, volumes could be written all about that by itself, but I think it's already a good enough starting point to invite you into the shift of attitude that phenomenology offers. See you next time.